Okay, welcome to Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation. And I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua, and we have today with us Dr. Russell Rickford, truly one of the rising stars in Black studies and history. And we're going to talk about a couple of his works. We'll be focused predominantly on We Are an African People, which is a history of the Council of Independent Black institutions, as well as the movement to create what were called in the day liberation schools. But we will also talk a bit about his new book on Sister Betty Shabazz surviving Malcolm. So let's get started. So, Dr. Rickford.
Excuse me for the interruption, brother Sundiata. I appreciate the introduction. I just need to clarify that the book on Betty Shabazz is not a new book. It must be going on 15, almost 20 years now. So it's an older book. It's a book I actually did prior to my graduate training, prior to my training as a historian, before I went to grad school.
That is interesting because okay. I had never seen it advertised until a few months ago.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it was, I think it had a relatively limited, circulation. It was a smaller press at the time. And so I still get, emails and comments about it from time to time, but it's generally from folks who, they got it from somebody else or that kind of thing, word of mouth. But I'm happy to talk about it, and it was a vital part of my intellectual development.
That, as I say, I'm not usually shocked or wrong, but I am this time.
It won't be a precedent, I'm sure.
So what I always try and do with my guests is start with getting a sense of who you are, where you come from. So the first question, or series of questions really, is when and where were you born? Where did you spend your formative years? What city, town, area? And how did your class background, the place and time in which you grew up, impact your developing political consciousness, and particularly your decision to labor in the vineyard of Black studies?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent question. I was born in Guyana, South America, occasionally mistaken for Ghana or Guinea, Africa, but Guyana is, culturally and historically part of the Caribbean, even though it sits on the South American continent, on the English-speaking country in South America. So I was born in Georgetown, Guyana, the capital, in 1975, and then, as a young child, I was around 5. My family moved to Northern California, to the San Francisco area. Palo Alto was the town I grew up in. It's the home of Stanford University. My dad got a job there at Stanford teaching in 1980. So I grew up in that area, which of course is better known now as the sort of center of tech, Silicon Valley, and so very much a solidly middle class upbringing, very, very loving family, very privileged upbringing in many ways, and sort of thoroughly petty bourgeois, I would say, and I certainly absorbed from my parents, from my family, a belief in social and racial justice in many ways, but I would say filtered through the lens of bourgeois values in many ways. How did I come to Black studies? I would have to say Malcolm. I came to Black studies through Malcolm X. I sort of fell in love with Malcolm politically in high school. I was coming of age in the late 80s and early 90s, which was a moment of sort of political, social, cultural resurgence of not only Malcolm X, but I would say Black nationalism, a kind of neo-Black nationalism. And so that was very much the framework in which I came to understand the political world. But Malcolm was the epicenter of that, the sort of revived Malcolm, resurrected Malcolm, rediscovered Malcolm of that time. Of course, this was a time of Spike Lee's, Malcolm X movie, despite its flaws. And so many of us were sort of rediscovering this icon, this international icon of Black struggle, anti-imperialist struggle against white supremacy. So I like many members of a previous generation, decided that I was going to try and model my life after Malcolm. I certainly at least model my my consciousness, after Malcolm. And I think that started me on the path to researching the Black past with an eye toward liberation. And I'm a historian today, and I work in a history department, but I consider myself, politically and intellectually, and in many ways spiritually grounded in the liberatory project of Black studies.
So, did that past background of coming to Malcolm, and I was intrigued because essentially what you described is what my generation would have described, that we discovered Malcolm in high school. Did that influence your move? And I hope I'm correct. I don't want to make two mistakes this year.
In the same evening.
In the same evening. That you worked on Manny Marable's Malcolm Project.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. There's some events in between, I guess. So I graduated from high school in '93, and I attended Howard University, as you know. So I went to the Mecca, the capstone of Negro education, as they used to call it. And that was a transformative experience for me. It was an amazing experience, socially and culturally. And I think sort of politically at that time, I would describe myself, late teens, early 20s. Certainly I would describe myself as a Black nationalist. And I would also describe myself today, at that time, as a bourgeois nationalist, which I know is a phrase that you use as well. In the sense that I had not fundamentally challenged many of the ideals, principles of bourgeois society, but I had simply sort of transposed them on a Black nationalist framing, but not a sort of expansive structural critique of white supremacy. But the sort of just the basic tenet of Black nationhood, Black nationality, that kind of consciousness, that kind of political project. After college, I started a long sort of period of transformation, of transition. And how did this sort of period of transition start? Well, in many ways, it came about as I sort of grappled with the contradictions of Black nationalism, the sort of political shortcomings, as I came to think of it.
So let me get you to spin back.
Sure.
Because one doesn't just wake up one morning and suddenly see the contradictions in Black nationalism, right? So I know we've had some communication, and I think in the book, We Are an African People, you talk about the Million Man March as kind of crystallizing the contradictions of bourgeois Black nationalism in terms of the lack of a political project, etc. So in addition to that experience, are there other experiences that you have that really put these the bourgeois Black nationalism in a critical perspective for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it's interesting looking back. It's difficult to pinpoint a moment. The reason why I sort of identify the Million Man March, it's useful to point to the Million Man March because it is a kind of a spectacular event, right? It's an outsized event. It was a kind of a pageant and a milestone, and it was a watershed to some extent for me in that, you know, I was very excited about it. I was very excited to participate. And in fact, my dad came out from the West Coast, and he and some of my frat brothers, we, you know, sort of marched, through the streets of Washington, D.C. from Howard University to the Lincoln Memorial, to the Capitol, to participate. And it was an incredibly moving experience in so many ways. I wrote about it years ago when I was still in college. But as I was out there, and particularly as I was listening to, you know, standing on the National Mall and listening to the speakers, and Minister Louis Farrakhan in particular, you know, Minister Farrakhan's address that day was very peculiar. You know, I mean, it was a kind of a long, rambling pastiche of kind of sort of medley of Black nationalist ideals. But I just kept thinking, you know, why are we here? What is the purpose? And being a Malcolmite, being someone who, you know, had sort of voraciously consumed everything I could, you know, get my hands on by Malcolm X, you know, not only Minister Farrakhan's speech, but the whole tenor of the day, the whole sort of message of the day seemed to lack a kind of indictment of white supremacy, that confrontation with global imperialism and racial capitalism that I felt was desperately needed. And in fact, I was looking for a kind of a revival, right, of those, militant themes. And so, you know, I can't, you know, it's a sort of neat narrative device to point to a particular this event or that event. It wasn't that simple, but certainly I was fishing for let's say a new religion, a new political framework. And around that time, so, you know, I graduated and I worked in Philly for a while. I was a kind of a cub reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I got an opportunity to do the book on Betty Shabazz. So I did the book on Betty Shabazz outside of graduate school. I hadn't gone back to graduate school yet. At some point, I discovered a book by the historian and political theorist Manning Marable, the late historian Manning Marable. And that book was How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. And the title was absolutely captivating for me. And I think I sat down and I essentially read it in one sitting. And I said, man, I gotta work with this guy. I gotta, you know, look him up. And it turned out he taught at a place called Columbia University in New York City. So I said, well, that's what I'm gonna go study. And so I did. Went first did a master's in African American Studies under Manning, Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia, and then I went on to do a history PhD with him as my advisor. And so he helped to sort of introduce me to Marxism. Well, I wouldn't even say Marxism. I would say Manning helped introduce me to the language of class and race. Right, I had sort of cut my teeth on thinking through and talking about the contradictions of race in the United States. And, my graduate training and my time with Manning, and also work in study groups and sort of informal study groups, this kind of thing, helped me to think critically about class and about political economy, and helped me to become a sort of materialist in terms of my political analysis, and think through sort of social contradictions in terms of class and race simultaneously. So I would say that's how I ended up sort of at the political point where I could begin to critique myself as a bourgeois nationalist.
So now, another aspect that I like to do in this program, because we want to give people bibliographies and give them a sense of what one can read. So clearly, we've got that the autobiography of Malcolm plays a seminal role in how capitalism underdeveloped Black America. When we used to call it "How Cuba."
Right. Right.
And recognizing that the title was modeled after Walter Rodney's classic, How
Right.
Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
Underdeveloped
So were there any other seminal texts that impacted you during this period in which you're making an ideological transition?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, certainly, I'm glad you mentioned Rodney's, brilliant and classic text from the early 1970s, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Certainly, I read Rodney, and Rodney, as you know, is my fellow Guyanese.
Yes.
He's a personal hero of mine, not just in terms of his analysis and his Marxism, but also his Pan-Africanism, his internationalism, and his model as a scholar, activist, activist intellectual, I guess I should say, a kind of engaged, militant approach to pedagogy and to epistemology that is, not just about an ivory tower and a kind of a stale bourgeois existence within the academy, which is about struggle, concrete struggle. So, thank you for mentioning Walter Rodney. I think there are other folks, Frantz Fanon, I read C.L.R. James. So in many ways, I was kind of rediscovering not only Malcolm, but I was rediscovering a literature, certainly from post, World War II, but really from the 1960s and 1970s. So I was rediscovering the kind of classic works that had, in many ways, inspired and influenced many of the participants in the civil rights and Black Power generation. So I came to Marxism, I think, not necessarily through Marx and Engels per se, but I came at it through these, so-called third world thinkers, third world Marxists or unorthodox Marxists, or, these Black and brown internationalists who were thinking through problems of white supremacy and capitalism and colonialism and post-colonialism, right? C.L.R. James.
Yeah.
And later I would come to, to great, women in the tradition as well, people like Claudia Jones.
Yes.
So, that was my introduction to, to dialectical materialism, right? That was my introduction to thinking through society in a scientific way, in an internationalist way, and in a way that really thought deeply about liberation. That was not just about kind of skin politics, which is how I might, critically, retroactively describe my thought from high school through, let's say, much of my 1920s, much of my 20s rather.
Yeah.
Certainly not the 90s.
Yeah.
Much of my 20s. and this was an evolution. Again, for me, this was a late evolution. This was an evolution well after undergrad. I'm always impressed. Today I teach at Cornell University, and even at a bourgeois institution, even at an elite private institution like Cornell, I find some radical young comrades, and I'm always impressed at their level of sophistication at that young age, because I was not thinking in those sophisticated terms at that age.
What I find absolutely intriguing in your political profile is that it mirrors mine in that sense. I think I probably got involved in activism at a much younger age, but the texts that you read are texts that I was reading, and there's probably somewhere between 15 and 20 years that separate us. So it's intriguing that those texts became seminal. So now, having established that you came to Marxism through a Black lens, and I think that many of us in the 60s and 70s came to Marxism through an anti-colonial lens. And I've always, and we're getting a little off script, but I've always found that there's a difference between Black folk who find their way to Marxism, scientific socialism, from out of a radical Black experience, as opposed to those who come through white-dominated left organizations. Have you found that to be the case?
I think so. I think so. And to be honest with you, I actually, now that you say that, I also want to say something about how a kind of fundamental Black nationalist orientation I found to be tremendously useful in the context of the 90s and the late 80s, in the context of trying to come to terms with Reaganism and its aftermath, in the context of trying to come to terms with Bush, in the context of trying to come to terms with Rodney King, in the context of trying to come to terms later on, even with something like Katrina, which was in a moment of my sort of political transition. But I talk about this with some of my comrades, some of whom are progressive, some of whom are more sort of avowed leftists, but all of whom I think, like me, cut their teeth, and many of them around my same age, cut their teeth politically on Black nationalism, and in the context of this Black nationalist revival of the 1990s, and that included the hip hop, certainly included the sort of Malcolm X iconography, et cetera, et cetera. The Black bookstores. Which is how a lot of these titles these titles from the 1970s, the West and the Rest of Us, or Chiweezel. Some of the Dr. Ben and the Chancellor Williams, all of that was on our shelves at Howard University, and you had to be somewhat conversant in there. And so what I want to say is that, make a point about Black nationalism, because I'm being critical and purposefully critical of what I would call a narrow or bourgeois nationalism that fails to confront capitalism, that fails to confront empire fundamentally. But I think that Black nationalist orientation did arm me with a certain militancy, did arm me with a certain oppositional impulse, with a certain sensibility, right? With a craving for Black consciousness, for Black pride, and even a principle like a kind of Black unity, which I would have sort of expressed uncritically, perhaps at age 18 or 21 or 25. I think still there was a sense of collectivity, right? It wasn't bourgeois in the sense of a kind of bourgeois individualism, right? But there was a kind of a pursuit of a kind of collective awareness that I found tremendously helpful and useful in terms of battling white supremacy. And so perhaps rather than a evolution or a transition, I should describe it as a kind of an evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I will also say that, again, coming to Marx, not just, picking up Capital and trying to wrestle with it from a young age, and I'm still trying to wrestle with it, but really, reading folks who more or less look like me, and who, were trying to think through questions of colonialism, not as and white supremacy, not as a kind of abstract question, but in terms of their own liberation and in terms of the liberation of their people. That was essential for me because, and coming to understand how Malcolm himself was engaged in a radical internationalist critique, was particularly toward the end of his life, but really throughout his political life, engaging with, radical thinkers, with revolutionaries, around the world. That is critical to sort of grounding myself, understanding, not just the material realities, the social realities of Black and brown people, oppressed people around the world, but it helps me as I relate to the so-called white left, and it helps me to understand the contradictions among some of my white, comrades on the left as well, and be critical of it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm reminded of what Fanon says in Wretched of the Earth, chapter 4 on national culture, where he makes the point that Marxism must always be stretched, right, in dealing with the colonial question, right? That's and C.L.R. James' argument that to make race fundamental in questions of imperialism is an error, but to make race incidental is an even graver error, right? So that's how we come to Marxism and the relationship between race and class. I want to now kind of shift to the book in particular. Before I do, I want to give you a bit of biography. I graduated from Tougaloo College in Tougaloo, Mississippi, 5 miles outside of Jackson.
Yes, sir.
And my senior year, I taught under Howard Spencer at the Black and Proud School.
Okay. But so Black and Proud, in my epilogue, I point to Black and Proud because the book, I didn't want the book to be a declension narrative. I didn't want the book to be to basically the arc of the book to be, late 60s, these independent Black institutions developing and they're promising politically in all these ways. And then, sort of tracing a decline to a kind of a, what I see as a conservative Afrocentrism in the 1980s. I wanted to point to some institutions that actually did survive, which was one of the biggest obstacles for these independent Black institutions that actually not only survived, but continued to thrive in terms of, conveying these radical political ideas. And so there was only 2 examples that I could, well, it's probably more I could have pointed to, but there was 2 that I pointed out in particular, which was the Oakland Community School, which was the Black Panther Project, and under Erica Huggins in particular, and Black and Proud, Liberation School. So I'm delighted. I didn't even know about that, or if I knew, I may have known about it, but I didn't think of it just now. So thank you for that example.
Thank you for this work. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and it is the best book in the field, bar none. There's no doubt about that. And some of the things that I like about it is the way in which you really get inside the different schools and show relationships. But the question I have is about this genealogy, this evolution of independent Black schools or Black schooling, right? So that you trace the beginnings of the freedom school concept in SNCC in the days in which it's making its transition to Black Power. So it's 64 Freedom Summer. And then you talk about the rise of the independent Black schools, and you do differentiate the Panthers Educational Project from what becomes the Council of Independent Black Institutions. And then you bring us down to what we'll call the Afrocentric private schools and charter schools that emerge in the 80s and 90s. Can you unpack that process and the relationships between those earlier initiatives and give us a political analysis as well as a pedagogical analysis?
Sure, but when I start rambling, you're gonna have to reel me back in.
Okay, I will.
So, I mean, this is gonna be a rough sketch. So I think that there'll be a little there'll be a little overgeneralization here. But so when we talk about the freedom schools, it's actually freedom schools itself is a relatively wide category. I mean, all of these schools that I'm discussing, I sort of put them under the category of movement schools. These are schools, these are pedagogical models, independent, schooling projects that came out of mass movement. So, came out of mass struggle. So, in the context of the civil rights movement, the struggle for desegregation, Black freedom struggle in the 1960s, you had a number of freedom schools, North and South. We tend to talk about the freedom schools in the South, particularly those associated with SNCC and other Black civil rights groups, particularly in the context of Freedom Summer in Mississippi in '64. But there were other freedom schools. There were freedom schools in New York, et cetera. But in any case, the freedom schools, when we talk about, 64, tended to be, they were doing a number of things. They were amazing things, really. One of the things they were doing is providing a sophisticated education, a sort of critical, social and academic education to Black folks who were systematically denied, basic education, basic educational resources. So it was helping to, expose and cultivate ideas, ideas about freedom, ideas about the good society among young people and even young adults who were hungry for that kind of discussion in a systematic way. But again, they also tended to be based on the premise that the goal of the struggle, the goal of Black people was at least in part the redemption of U.S. society. That the tremendous contradiction between the ideals of freedom and liberty and democracy and the realities of white supremacy and poverty and war, et cetera, could be reconciled by a grassroots project of social change, of rebellion.
So let me press you here. What made them different from the type of education that Black people were predominantly getting, be it in Mississippi or be it in New York City? And as a kind of example, there's a wonderful discussion in Stokely Speaks where Kwame Ture, at a very young age, is leading a freedom school. And the pedagogy is Pablo Freire before Pablo Freire became known in the U.S.
Yeah,
I mean, it demonstrates the brilliance of Kwame Ture.
Yeah. So I mean, like Ferrer, so that famous and brilliant lesson from the young Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, was Ferrerian. It was based on it sort of drew on ideals that would be popularized by people like Paulo Freire, in that it was not about simply implanting into the heads of your pupils a body of information, but it was really about drawing out of them their capacity, right, to think critically about their circumstances, and based upon that, to draw conclusions about the world, and to pursue human dignity on a larger scale, right? I mean, and he does this through talking about, Black dialect. He does this through talking about, when somebody says, I drinks wine, right? Why do we discount that? What is the social value of that? Does communication occur? So, I mean, he questions all of these premises that are really lie at the heart of white supremacy. And, I think it's the kind of thing that Malcolm X was talking about when Malcolm talked about education, when Malcolm talked about a redemptive education. Malcolm always insisted that, you don't have a segregated school just because all of the students are Black or the students are Black and brown. He says segregation is about oppression. You have a segregated school when it's controlled by outsiders, when outsiders are controlling the curriculum, when they're controlling, what's being taught and why it's being taught. So that's an excellent, example, Stokely's lesson of the kind of liberatory education that took place at best at many of the freedom schools. There's a trend.
Transition us to the
there's a distinction.
Independent Black institutions of SIBI.
Sure. I mean, I want to just say a word about Black Panther liberation schools, because Black Panther liberation schools, which came out, not much later. These were closely linked to the Black Panthers breakfast program, but the Black Panthers liberation schools were really about helping children, Black children, but also, other children, particularly poor, urban kids, working class, to understand an anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist outlook, right? And to show them how the sort of material realities of their lives could fit into that kind of a framework, a third worldist framework, right? The Pan-African nationalist schools that I focus on in We Are an African People were a little bit different, right? Because one of the main principles of the Pan-African nationalist schools was really about re-identification, right? It was about, based upon this analysis that Black people had essentially been in the United States as they were elsewhere, that Black people had essentially been colonized. They had been colonized in many ways, economically, politically, but they'd also been psychologically and mentally colonized by a white supremacist society and by a white supremacist education. And therefore, they needed to undergo a process of decolonization. And part of that process of decolonization for these Pan-Africanist schools was about a re-identification. So shifting young people from a kind of Negro sensibility and self-identity and mentality towards an African consciousness and identity. And that's where the title of the book, We Are an African People, which is a very popular, slogan of the time, that's where it comes from. Moreover, one of the fundamental aims of these schools was to create a generation of trained, highly trained, and militant young people, experts, particularly in technical areas, who could then fan out across the Black world. So, I mean, not just throughout the United States, but in post-colonial societies on the African continent, perhaps in the Caribbean, etc., and serve nation-building projects around the world, right? So it was explicitly tied to a project of nation building, certainly concepts of nation building within the United States, but also nation building in the post-colonial world, so that these alumni, if you will, would be trained technically and ideologically to participate in development projects, in progressive post-colonial societies.
So here's my question about difference. The Pan-African nationalist schools, and I'll just say the Council of Independent Black Institutions framework,
Mm-hmm.
if they were to go to a place like Tanzania, Guinea, Ghana, particularly under Nkrumah, would they, in addition to bringing a technical expertise, would they bring something beyond what you called skin politics? Would they come with, would they simply seek to fold into a neo-colonial project, or were they being trained to oppose capital?
Right.
And
So
imperialism.
yes, absolutely. So I think in many of these institutions, in many of these Pan-Africanist institutions, particularly in their heyday, which I would say is essentially the 1970s and probably particularly the early mid 70s, many of these institutions, most of them, I would say, were to a greater or lesser extent, that their Pan-Africanist politics did draw on a kind of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, or what I call in the book a kind of left Pan-Africanism. Mm-hmm. So it was a Pan-Africanism. It may have been skeptical to, or even hostile to, many traditions of Western Marxism, because there was a widespread belief that the white working class was conservative, if not reactionary. Mm-hmm. So there was real skepticism of a kind of interracial class politics, but there was certainly an emphasis on understanding white supremacy as inextricable from global capitalism, and understanding imperialism as an outgrowth of capitalism. So understanding, for example, the struggle against colonialism and the ongoing armed struggles against, settler colonialism and white minority rule in Southern Africa, which was an important sort of political touchstone of the 1960s and 1970s, as a result of not just, racial animosity, but as a systematic attempt to exploit and to continue to exploit the labor and the minerals and resources of these, colonial territories. So that was that's part of the politics. It's part of the pedagogy. That's part of what I describe in the book. And so by the time we get to the 1980s and the popularization of Afrocentrism, the story that I tell in the book is really about the stripping away of some of these radical currents, some of these radical ideas from the framework of Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism, right? And so what you're left with is a kind of Black nationalist politics that does not explicitly confront imperialism, that does not explicitly confront capitalism. And now we're back to the kind of bourgeois nationalism that we were talking about, that I initially imbibed, right? Coming of age in the 1980s and 1990s, and fashioning myself as an Afrocentrist. In fact, in high school and early in college, my ambition, you'll get a kick out of this, I wanted to open up an Afrocentric school. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to, when I met
another thing we share.
See, and a good head of hair also.
Yeah, absolutely.
we could be cousins.
Yeah.
So when I, so you can imagine when I was at Howard, And, Dr. Molefi Asante, one of the most important theorists of the Afrocentric movement, was a visiting professor. So I was in the School of Communications. He was doing some kind of visiting professorship during my time there in the School of Communications. I got to take a very, very small seminar. It was only a handful of us. And I was just, I was awestruck. I mean, I was hanging on his every word. I remember the brother saying, talking about getting up in the morning and orienting himself toward Africa. And I remember getting up in the morning, I would try and orient myself, probably taking it too literally,
His Africa was of kings and queens, man.
Right. So this is part of the political and intellectual impetus for doing this book. We're an African people trying to, it's not all, what we do as scholars is not all self-therapy, but it's always a little bit autobiographical. This bourgeois nationalism in the 1970s and 80s, for example, this was it was valorizing people like Idi Amin of Uganda, right? This butcher, right? Murdering African people. But he was projecting these Black nationalist symbols, Savimbi of in Angola, right?
Yes.
Right. So who was sort of recreating some of this iconography of Black power, but was very closely tied to the Reagan administration, was very closely tied to apartheid South Africa. And so the idea that the post-colonialism was not just about trading white rulers for Black rulers, that liberation, more importantly, was not just about changing the colors of the administrators of the rulers, but really was about a substantive transformation of society, was about creating a truly humane and egalitarian society. Of course, that is an ideal that we'll pursue for the rest of our lives, but it certainly was not, could not be equated with these neo-colonialists, right, who really were making accommodations, who were appeasing capitalism and imperialism.
So let me get you to talk process and as detailed and down on the ground as you can get. What's the sandpaper that's used to scrub off the remaining veneer of an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist pedagogy in these independent schools? How do we get to this kind of Afrocentrism that, I'm just, I am who I am, right? That is more reflective of a Molefi Asante endorsement of pharaohs and kings,
right,
as opposed to a critique of a ruling class that seems to have been at the heart of even some of the freedom schools of SNCC, but certainly the Panther School and much of the CIBI institutions.
Sure.
What scrubs away that incisive class analysis that was tied to an understanding of anti-Black racial oppression?
Sure. Well, that is we got to do another show on that.
Then we will. Okay. That's the power of the Black Power media, right?
That's what I'm talking about.
We are in control of this.
I hear that. But I do want, since we talked about bibliography earlier, I do want to mention a book that I think comes closer to answering that question than any other I can think of off the top of my head. And that is by my brother Cedric Johnson, and the book
to race for some of the race leaders, from revolutionaries to race leaders. Yes,
from revolutionaries to race leaders. That was one of the most important books for me when I was in grad school, and subsequently, Cedric was very gracious to be a mentor with me as I was polishing up We Are an African People. But I think that tells the story of this transition. I mean, it's very clear-eyed about the limitations of Black power, and I think I try and be sympathetic, but in a critical way, of Black power as well in my book. But certainly, I try and highlight, as you say, these genuinely radical liberatory political elements and ideological elements that simply were not present, or certainly were not as prevalent in the later Black nationalist manifestations that sort of fell under the category of Afrocentrism in the 1980s and beyond, which was also, we should say, the heyday of the Afrocentric schools. So it was a kind of another generation of independent schools and Africa-centered Black education. There are many, many factors here. There are internal factors, there are external factors. Certainly, repression. We're here in Black August, so we have to always remember the intense repression from the FBI, from the state apparatus, police forces. We also have to think about the internal weaknesses, and this is something Cedric Johnson really, concentrates on from revolutionaries to race leaders. But I think that the truth is that these forces are always present, within the sort of broad landscape of Black nationalism. And the truth is that, we tend to think about Black nationalism in terms of specific organizations. But I think, I always tell my classes, my Black radicalism classes, it's very difficult to find a Black person, I think, who doesn't exhibit any sort of Black nationalist sensibility whatsoever, who would sort of disavow any principles of Black nationalism. This is sort of part of the cultural politics of Black folk. But within that sort of broad universe, there are always sort of more bourgeois, more conservative, more patriarchal, more Black capitalist, et cetera, tendencies. And then there are tendencies that are much more sympathetic to anti-imperialism, much more sympathetic to anti-capitalism, et cetera. And why some of those tendencies would recede or go underground or withdraw in certain political moments, certain historical moments, while other tendencies come to the fore. I think that is the critical question. And I think that the much about the sort of political and social realities of the 1980s and 1990s created a market, right, for a kind of more conservative Black nationalism. That capitalism was in many ways quite eager to encourage, quite eager to project. And so that sort of started the cycle. I see my life, my sort of political life, my adult life unfolding as a kind of in the aftermath of Black power, and trying to come to terms with what happened to these radical tendencies. I think if I'd have known Brother Sundiata, if I think I'd known brothers and sisters like yourself, who were direct connection to some of these radical movements, I could have spent less time on research and more time on getting my head straight.
Well, I appreciate that comment, and I think you've done a masterful job in your political and pedagogical development. You're truly one of the shining stars out there, Russell. So, and I don't, say that lightly.
Thank you, brother.
So there's a lot of comments in the chat. Okay. There's not any direct questions, but there are certainly things that I think we should engage. And I want to save time to have you talk about, what's on your mind now to kind of sum up this conversation and point to new projects that you're involved in.
Mm-hmm.
But the kind of theme that is emerging from the chat is the notion that we have to have independent schools. And within that, there seems to be some people who are arguing that we need schools more along the lines of what Sibi was doing, that kind of project.
Mm-hmm.
But the main thing is that they're in our hands. And then there's others who are saying that we need Saturday schools.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a question of community control of public schools.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that there are more than those three models, but those are the kinds of ideas that are coming out of the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you, can you discuss what do you think would be the most viable path for us to take, with the idea that we're not trying to develop simply an elite cadre of warriors. We're trying to transform the education of the majority of working class Black folks trapped in a white supremacist and pedagogically unimaginative schooling process.
Mm-hmm. So I get iterations of this question a lot when I speak about the book, because when you talk to Black folks, and the folks are interested to some extent in the history of Black independent schools and Black Power movement, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what they want to know is, how do we fix the mess we're in right now?
And material question.
And that is the material question. And as somebody who, as you can tell, likes to talk, I always have the least satisfying answers to this. And I don't want to be glib, but one of the first things I always say is, there's a quote. I should get this quote right, but I have to say it's a paraphrase by the great leftist theorist and activist Doxy Wilkerson, and he said something to the effect of, "It is not the education of the Negro that will bring about," he said, their education or their liberation. It is the liberation of the Negro that will bring about their proper education, right? Which is to say that, schools are a reflection of our society. And all of these models that we have been, for the most part, venerating, from the 1960s and onward, were thrown up by, were produced by mass struggle, were produced by people actively, working class folks, actively struggling with the contradictions in their lives and trying to build a mass movement, and thinking about the kinds of pedagogy, the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of knowledge production, knowledge making that would enable grassroots folks, ordinary folks, to build a new world, right? To build a new world. And this is a long tradition. It goes back well before the 1960s. You can talk about, the Garvey movement. You can talk about the 19th century schools. You can talk about schools during Black schools, independent schools during the era of slavery, et cetera. My book is We're an African People is really a political analysis of this movement within the context of Black Power, this Black independent school movement. So sort of political ideas and how they were practiced, and the sort of praxis of these activists and organizers and educators, that was a primary concern to me. So the actual pedagogy, the classroom exchanges themselves was, I have to say, something of a secondary concern. But obviously, the point that I want to make is that we have to struggle to change society broadly, even as we deal with the question of education. The other point I want to make is that As much as I think that there's so many benefits of, and there's so many wonderful characteristics, I think, of some of these independent models that we can point to. We have to fight for the soul of public education. We cannot withdraw from public education. And ultimately, the public schools will be the place where the vast majority of Black and brown children are socialized and educated or miseducated. And we have to fight for the kind of social provisions. We have to fight for the kind of society in which children actually are gaining access to the resources that they need, material and intellectual and emotional and otherwise, in order to pursue human dignity, right? So that's another point I make. And then what I'd also say is that I don't want to fetishize any particular model or any particular institutional form. What I want to, I think, what I want to praise, what I want to valorize is the spirit of education. When you mentioned that lesson that Brother Stokely was doing in the Freedom School, that was really trying to show young people that their culture was not deficient, right? That within that what they absorbed from their families, what they learned from their grandparents and their parents, had within it that culture had within it tremendous capacity for self-liberation, right? And it was a matter of harnessing these resources that already lay within them. So it was not a project. It was not a project of indoctrination, and it was not a project of necessarily of re-educating, right? I mean, education is always about socialization, right? We want our children to be socialized in particular ways, but it wasn't about a re-education. There was a tremendous belief in the capacity of ordinary people to change their lives given the right resources, right? And I think that we have to hold that principle. This is a principle that comes from, Ella Baker. This is a principle that comes from Septima Clark, a long line of education, and also people like Ferrer and others. I think it's a critical question to ask now in the context of the kind of culture wars that are happening today. So, this sort of non-conversation that's happening around critical race theory, the controversy over the 1619 Project, the struggles to pull down some of these Confederate statues and symbols. I'm encouraged in some ways by these struggles because if we're having if we're engaging these questions, then at least we're struggling toward clarifying for ourselves and for our children what is the real meaning and purpose of education. What is the real meaning of historical and purpose of historical consciousness, right? Et cetera. Who are we as a society? I'm struck by the incredibly facile and ridiculous answers that by and large Americans are coming up with when faced with these questions. So I think we have to engage. I mean, I think that's I think that activists, I think people of conscience, I think anti-racists, we have to struggle against this foolishness. I think there's really, what Gramsci might call a war of position that is occurring right now, and I think that we have to struggle for for the balance of power.
What I'm hearing you say, somehow I'm getting that. Okay, let me see what I can do here. But what I think I'm hearing you say is that it's the pedagogy and the content, not the form in which it's delivered, that matters most. And I want to pick up something that you said earlier, and then I want to lead you to respond to a question, and then give you a couple minutes to wrap up. So what I want to raise is that pulling out of the Kwame Ture exercise in the Freedom School, you highlighted the fact that he mounted he pulled out of the children a defense of African American vernacular English or Ebonics, which we should read as a defense of our culture, right? And of course, he's using a pedagogical style that is not rooted on the kind of banking method where you're pouring information in, but that you are actually helping people explore the world. I once had a debate with Maulana Karinga at NCBS, National Council for Black Studies. And what the debate pivoted around was the extent to which African Americans had indeed come under the hegemony of white ideas in the period of emancipation. And what Maulana's argument was essentially it's probably built on the old Malcolm quote, and certainly it's a Farrakhan piece that we lost everything. We lost our religion. We lost our God. We lost our minds. And my read is that it's the Sterling Stuckey read, right? That we developed a creolized process in which the hundreds of African groups came together to create a new African culture that, of course, also had elements that they found useful from white America, from indigenous peoples, but that they constructed a culture that was largely at its base African. And here I think about, the sharpest critique to make towards someone like Malefi in the Pharaoh piece is that most African Americans came out of what's called the acephalous societies, those headless societies that did not have kings and queens, but in fact operated through councils of elders and a village assembly. That's where we really came from. We weren't part of the kingdoms. The kingdoms were capturing us, right? So I get that twisted. And that culture that was developed through that creolized process had a heavy emphasis on things like communalism and commonality, mutual, those kinds of things. And that we have to speak to the ways in which our culture was modified, but largely in ways that we believe would benefit us. Now, that doesn't mean we were correct, but it does mean that largely that process of shifting and sorting out was done so that we have a culture, and that culture, like all cultures, has things that are progressive and things that are regressive, and that the cultural nationalist piece that evolves into Afrocentrism says we need to import a new culture because the one we have is so deficient and defective. Can you react to that? And then I want to give you a question that's coming out of the chat.
Okay. All right. But you're going to give me like 48 hours to speak to this, right?
I recognize that within you is the ability to be so concise.
That's not something I'm generally accused of, but
it's fair. I see it.
First of all, I want to say, peace to Sterling Stuckey, and I'm glad you invoked that name. And look, here's what I want to say. There's nothing wrong with this.
Thank you.
there's nothing wrong with black people. You know, there's nothing wrong with black people. And it's actually, it's a very simple comment, but it's quite profound. And I think that we need to say it more, and we need to say it publicly. There's nothing, it ain't nothing that, to be more to the point, to use the black vernacular, ain't nothing wrong with black folks, right? In fact, right, the fact that we have survived, not only survived, but we have found a way to flourish, you know, in this, as they used to say, in this hell of North America. You know, we found a way to look at what we've created, right? Look at what we've done. Look at who we are. There's nothing wrong. And that is such an important principle, because this is what white supremacy does. White supremacy doesn't just want to rob you of your labor. It doesn't just want to exploit you, you know, socially and economically. It also wants to degrade you, you know. As Fanon and others said, it wants to degrade your history, deny your history, and so destroy you psychologically. So, and the irony is that many of our leaders who profess to be our strongest advocates serve as an alibi for this destruction by reproducing some of the premises of white supremacy, which is based on these profound anti-black ideology, right? Ideas. This notion that we're fundamentally damaged, right? That our culture is deficient, right? You know, this is something that we have to struggle against, and it's something we have to speak explicitly to our children about. Not just speak to them, we have to demonstrate to them.
That's right.
That we love, not only do we love them, but we love black people so much.
Yes.
We love black people because black people are worthy of being loved, right? You know, the Black Lives Matter movement, I have a lot of critiques of Black Lives Matter, but the fundamental idea, even that slogan, Black Lives Matter, you know, I mean, the first time I heard it, I thought, well, damn, that's not strong enough. You know, like back in the day, you had black power. Now you just say, well, we matter.
Right.
But you know, but there's
it was at a moment where we needed to know we needed to
hear that. You know, I'm like, damn, we used to have black is beautiful.
Yeah.
But that's so. I mean, so rejecting that damage theory, that you know, that notion that we're fundamentally flawed, that we're fundamentally damaged, I think is an important part of it. The other thing I would say, though, about I would also be very wary of a kind of a atavism. I'd be very wary of a kind of backward-looking. You know, I'm a historian, so I think I think it's worthy to study the past. And you know, Malcolm himself said, you know, history is best qualified to reward our research. However, we have to be very careful about tradition. You know, tradition is a very seductive ideal. And it can make us do a lot of backwards things, and it can make us valorize a lot of backwards things, like kings and queens, like monarchy. You know, shit, the reason why we, by and large, that we venerate the governmental form of monarchy so much, that comes from Europe. Right, that's Eurocentric. Right? You know, I mean, yeah, we had kings and queens, but most of us weren't kings and queens, right? And when you know, I mean, a king, you know, the thing is, why do we celebrate these models of society and these models of governance that we would never accept in the here and now? If I said, you know, Sundiata, I'm gonna be your prince, I'll be your black king, you bow down to me. You know,
right.
Come on, man.
There'd be a rumble on. But, you know, there's something in American society that tells us that white people were never really about bourgeois democracy, because they just seem so attached to the British monarchy. And it's like, who gives a fuck?
Every time I go to the grocery store, I'm in the aisles, and it's like Prince such and such, Princess such. Yeah. Oh my God! You know, first of all, didn't y'all fight a war with these people?
Right. I mean, I thought that's y'all's highest moment. Right. You know what I'm saying? Look, you know, the French got that shit right. Let's be clear.
bring the guillotine back. And I tell you, man, we need to bring the guillotine back. That's how we, we got all these millionaires blasting off,
Yeah,
or
these
sorry,
billionaires.
I'm sorry, billionaires,
billionaires, yeah,
blasting off into space. Man, we got to bring the guillotine back. So,
okay. So let's wrap with this. Okay, wrap that up.
Let's
Go ahead, finish your point, and then we'll
I
wrap
was
up.
just going to say that's the truly difficult thing. And this is, I mean, this sort of parallels. Not at all to suggest I'm at the end of my political journey. I'm right at the beginning of my political journey, but I do remember profoundly, in the course of my 20s and 30s, coming to the realization that, in fact, it was more difficult to pursue the truth than it was to just absorb this mythology or that mythology. So to replace a Western white mythology with a so-called Black or Afrocentric mythology, to replace one set of kings and queens with another set of kings and queens, but to pursue a project of emancipation that has relevance to the masses of Black people, right? Who not only are not kings and queens, but don't have access to decent housing or decent education or decent transportation or decent housing. This is the kind of social transformation that we need, and this is why I think that that socialism, why I think that a truly transformative project of democracy based on mass struggle, right, is the kind of is what we need to produce the right questions. Yes. Right, and begin to struggle towards some clarity in our current crisis of capitalism.
Okay, so last question we want to get in, and we're going to end in 6 minutes for sure. All right, so Blood Honey wants to know if you can talk about whether or not the kind of Pan-African nationalist institutions, educational institutions that emerged in the U.S. had any resonance in post-colonial or decolonial education in the Caribbean specifically. And let's fold your native state, Guyana, into that conversation.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So did the struggle for a Pan-Africanist or Pan-African nationalist education, did the struggle for a relevant education, for a Black education, for a liberatory education, did that have resonances in the Caribbean? Absolutely. And Black Power in the Caribbean. I mean, this is part of what I'm writing about now. I'm currently doing a book about Guyana, actually, about Guyana and African American radical politics in the 1970s, and there was a good deal of exchange between Pan-Africanists, Black internationalists in the U.S. and in the Caribbean and in Guyana in particular. There were some Black folks, activists, intellectuals, writers, artists who actually resettled in Guyana in the 1970s. Guyana at that time was ruled by Forbes Burnham, and Burnham appeared to be a Pan-Africanist, and he also appeared to be an anti-imperialist and a socialist. I mean, certainly many of his pronouncements were along those lines. It turns out, of course, that Burnham was deeply enmeshed with the CIA and Western imperialism, and so Burnham's long reign in Guyana actually had disastrous effects on the Guyanese society and the Guyanese economy. In fact, it's part of the reason that my family came to the United States in the first place, and why I grew up in the States. But certainly, yes, absolutely. Not only did these struggle for Pan-Africanist education unfold in the Caribbean, within the context, for example, of the Black Power movement in the Caribbean, but it also unfolded in the UK in the form of the Black Parents movement. There were analogous institutions and schools and in Canada. and in many other societies. So, I mean, there's tremendous scholarship, there's fantastic scholarship in the last several years, really exploring Black power as an international phenomenon. I just want to make the quick point about, again, specifically with respect to Guyana, because again, I'm writing about this now, and obviously a labor of love. Many of the African American activists, artists, and cultural figures who were drawn to Guyana, from the Black Power movement, the Black Arts movement. There were writers like Julian Mayfield who'd come out of the old left, artists like Tom Feelings, but many, a whole cast of characters who engaged fundamentally with Guyanese politics in the 1970s, in part because of the power of the sort of cultural revolution that was unfolding in Guyana. Especially under UC Quayana, who I call the Malcolm X of Guyana. UC Quayana, who's still living.
Really?
That's right. Yes, UC Quayana, and now in his he's got to be late 90s. But a big part of the attraction was the fact that there was this Black head of state, Forbes Burnham, particularly in a society in the Western Hemisphere, right? A society in which Black people were actually the numerical minority, right? Black folk only something like 30-something% of the population in Guyana. There's an Asian population, the so-called Indo-Guyanese, right? The descendants of their ancestors came as indentured workers from India.
Chetty Jagat.
Right, yeah. So who was the sort of father of Guyanese independence. But in any case, I mean, this allows me to, as we close, it allows me to make the point again about the sort of narrowness of a skin politics that equates color with liberation, right? And it's not that I am engaged in a reductive or mechanistic critique of any kind of racial consciousness and dismissing that as identity politics. I think we also have to push back against that. But I think that these cases that we're talking about, whether it's Burnham in Guyana, whether it's Idi Amin in Uganda, whether we're talking about Haiti, then or to some extent now, it's very seductive in the context when you're a marginalized minority within the context of the United States, to try and find a Black messiah, who somehow is going to embody, emancipation and liberation, or the sort of post-colonial ideal. And the reality is that within our individual societies, and even as we think globally, we have to engage in the kind of politics that's going to address and transform people's material realities, right? The masses of Black people. Don't talk to me about no kings and queens, right? I don't care about the kings and queens. To hell with the kings and queens, the Black kings and queens and the white kings and queens and everybody in between. To hell with the damn kings and queens, right? What we need to do is liberate working people, right? Poor people, oppressed people, right? And engage in the kind of militant struggle that is going to provide them with the resources that they need, the material resources that they need to live dignified lives, right? That is liberation. That is Black liberation.
And that is a powerful point to end on. Comrade, I want to thank you for joining me on Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation, part of the Black Power Media family. Our goal is to occupy 24 hours of revolutionary liberatory media. So let me say again, thank you so much, and I will have you back. And so let me now.
Thank you so much, Comrade Sundiata. This was a blast. I really appreciate it. Solidarity.